A 10-year-old getting pregnant has thrown the whole family into panic. They couldn't figure out who the father was, but on the day of the birth, the doctors found something unexpected. What really happened will leave you stunned. Althea and Lennox were the kind of parents who lived for their daughter. Zara, just 10 years old, was the center of their world. Together they were the perfect little family, always going on adventures, making memories, and enjoying every second of it. Lennox loved taking them out on weekends, whether it was to the movies or a trip to the fair. Althea made sure they always had something special to look forward to. She was big on family time. Zara thrived in that environment. A bright, bubbly child, she was the kind of girl everyone noticed for her good nature. Teachers loved her, friends adored her, and at home, she was the heart of the household. She could make anyone smile with her endless energy, her chatter filling every room with life. "That girl could talk till the cows come home," Lennox would joke, often with a grin, as Zara rattled off a million stories before finally drifting off to sleep. Yet happiness, it seemed, was not meant to last. It started out small, a little complaint here, a stomach ache there. "It's probably just something you ate," Althea said one evening when Zara mentioned feeling unwell after dinner. "A little rest, and you'll be good as new by morning." But Zara didn't feel better by morning. In fact, over the next few days, things seemed to worsen. She became quieter, a strange shift for a girl who never stopped talking. By the end of the week, Althea noticed that Zara seemed to be holding her stomach more often, wincing occasionally. One morning, as Althea helped her get dressed, she saw it, a slight bulge, round and hard, sticking out from her daughter's stomach. Her heart skipped a beat. "What is this?" she whispered, almost afraid of the answer. Zara shrugged, clearly just as confused as her mother. "Does it hurt?" Althea asked, her voice more urgent now. "How long has this been here?" "A few weeks," Zara mumbled, looking down unsure. Althea's mind raced. It couldn't be what she thought. No, it had to be something else, an infection, or something benign. She called Lennox into the room, her voice shaking, and when he saw it, his face turned pale. "We're going to the hospital," he said firmly, grabbing his keys without a second thought. Zara, usually so spirited and talkative, said nothing during the ride. The air in the car was thick with tension, every mile feeling like a lifetime as they made their way to the hospital. Althea's hands shook as she held on to her daughter, silently praying this was all just a misunderstanding. Once there, the nurses took them in quickly. Zara was examined, and tests were ordered. Althea and Lennox sat in the waiting room, their minds racing with possibilities, none of them good. It felt like forever before the doctor came back, his face unreadable. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news," he started, his voice low and steady. Althea's heart sank. She reached for Lennox's hand, gripping it tight as the doctor continued, "Your daughter Zara, she's pregnant." Time stopped. Althea blinked, trying to process what she had just heard. Pregnant. The word felt wrong in her mouth, impossible, absurd. Lennox's face went white, his knuckles turning pale as he gripped the armrest of the chair. "That's impossible," he stammered, his voice cracking with disbelief. "She's 10. She's just a child. How could—" "This is hard to understand," the doctor interrupted, choosing his words carefully. "But the tests are conclusive. Zara is several months along." "No," Althea whispered, shaking her head, tears blurring her vision. "There's been a mistake. This can't be," but the doctor just looked at her with that same solemn expression, the kind you'd expect when delivering bad news. Althea felt like the world was spinning. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Her daughter, her sweet, innocent little girl, was pregnant. How could this happen? Who did this? A dozen questions flooded her mind, none of them with answers she wanted to face. Lennox stood suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the tile floor. His face was contorted with anger, disbelief, and fear. "Who?" he demanded, his voice shaking but filled with rage. "Who did this to her?" "We don't know yet," the doctor said carefully. It's important we focus on Zara's health for now. No, Lennox growled, his voice rising. We need to know who's responsible. Someone hurt my daughter, and I want to know who. Althea was too numb to speak. Her world had collapsed around her in an instant. The laughter, the joy, the plans for the future all gone in a blink. I need to be with her, Althea finally managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. The doctor nodded, leading her into the room where Zara lay, oblivious to the storm she had just set off in her parents' lives. She looked up as Althea entered, her small face pale but calm. Am I going to be okay, Mom? Althea felt the tears well up in her eyes. Yes, sweetheart, she whispered, forcing a smile. We're going to figure this out. I promise. But deep down, Althea knew nothing would ever be the same again. Althea and Lennox were restless. Days turned into weeks, and they were no closer to understanding the unimaginable reality that had taken hold of their lives. Their daughter, Zara, 10 years old and still so full of innocence, was pregnant. Lennox, once the composed father with a quick smile and a gentle demeanor, was now seethed with a quiet but unrelenting anger. It festered deep within him, and every time he looked at Zara still acting as though the world hadn't changed, it tore at his heart. She played with her toys, chatted away as if nothing was wrong. There was no shame, no sorrow in her, just the pure confusion of a child who didn't understand the storm brewing around her. Lennox would stand there, his fists clenched, his heart aching. Althea, on the other hand, felt hollowed out by grief. She blamed herself over and over again for not seeing the signs, for not protecting Zara from whatever horror had befallen her. Her mind raced through endless scenarios, wondering what moment of carelessness had allowed this unspeakable tragedy to happen. At night, when the house was quiet and Lennox sat brooding in the next room, Althea would quietly cry, the tears soaking her pillow. Every part of her ached for the little girl who had been robbed of her childhood. Yet through all the pain, one thing remained: they were determined to find out the truth. The investigation began, though it wasn't official not yet. Althea and Lennox started with the men. Zara had come into contact with the familiar faces of their neighborhood, the teachers at her school, the bus driver who smiled too wide. No one seemed trustworthy anymore. Lennox made a list of every man Zara could have known. He brought up names, places, dates. The friendly school custodian, the cheerful gym teacher who always gave her extra time in PE, even the teenage boys who played basketball down the street, all of them Lennox thought were suspects. Who did this to you, Zara? Althea asked gently one evening, as she sat beside her daughter, her voice barely holding back the quiver of desperation. Zara, sitting cross-legged on her bed, looked up from the coloring book in her lap. I don't know, Mommy, she said softly, her face scrunching up in confusion. Nobody did anything. Althea's heart sank. The thought that someone had harmed her child, that someone had taken advantage of her innocence, was unbearable. Are you sure, baby? Did anyone touch you? Did anyone do something that made you feel uncomfortable or hurt? Zara shook her head with an earnestness that left no room for doubt. No, Mommy. No one did anything, I promise. Althea looked away, biting her lip to keep from crying. How could this be? How could her daughter, her sweet little girl, not know? Lennox, standing in the doorway, could barely contain his rage. His patience was wearing thin. It wasn't that he didn't believe Zara, it was that her confusion only deepened the mystery, and he needed the truth, no matter how painful. A few days later, DNA tests were done on the baby, as Lennox had pushed for. It convinced them it was the only way to uncover the truth. They tested every suspect on the list, the bus driver, the teachers, even a few neighbors. The tests came back negative, all of them. None of the men they suspected were the father. How is that possible? Lennox muttered angrily, pacing in the kitchen. It's like a ghost did this. His voice was low but filled with a burning fury that Althea had never heard before. She sat at the kitchen table, hands trembling as she stared at the papers in front of her. I don't know, she whispered, her voice breaking. I just don't know. The investigation hit a wall. Days stretched into weeks. The mystery deepened, and so did Lennox's frustration. Then, a small breakthrough came. It was the kind of moment that neither parent could have predicted but ultimately reshaped their understanding of what had happened. It was an ordinary afternoon at home. Althea had stepped out to run some errands, and Lennox was in the living room, reading through a pile of bills, his mind barely present in the mundane task. Zara sat on the floor nearby, playing quietly with her toys, her dolls lined up in a neat little row. One of the dolls caught Lennox's eye, the way it was positioned over another in a way that made him uncomfortable. His stomach tightened as a knot of unease formed. He cleared his throat. "Zara, what are you doing with your dolls?" Zara, without looking up, responded, "They're playing a game." Lennox's body stiffened, dread creeping into his bones. "What kind of game?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She looked up at him with a smile, completely unaware of the storm her innocent actions were stirring inside her father. "It's the game I play with Silas," she said. "The dolls are pretending to be me and Silas." Lennox froze. Silas? The neighbor's boy. He was 10, like Zara. They often played together harmless, innocent games, or so Lennox and Althea had always believed. "What do you mean, Zara?" Lennox asked. "What kind of game do you play with Silas?" His voice was tight, controlled, but he could feel the heat of rising panic. Zara, with the same innocent smile, placed one doll on top of the other, the smaller one underneath in a suggestive position. "We play like this," she said simply, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Lennox's blood ran cold. The room seemed to spin as his worst fears began to take shape. The positioning of the dolls left no room for misinterpretation. "This is it," he thought. The realization hit him like a sledgehammer. Silas. It wasn't he some adult, some stranger, or predator lurking in the shadows. It was Silas, the boy next door. Everything inside Lennox shattered in that moment. He didn't even pause to think. Rage overtook him like a tidal wave, and before he knew it, he was on his feet, storming out of the house. His mind was a blur of fury and disbelief. He couldn't breathe, he couldn't see straight. His feet carried him to Silas's house as if he were on autopilot, without a second thought. Lennox pounded on the door, each knock echoing louder than the last. His fist slammed against the wood as if he were trying to break it down. When Silas's father, Thaddeus, opened the door, his face turned to confusion as Lennox grabbed him by the collar and shoved him against the doorframe. "What did your son do to my daughter?" Lennox's voice was low, but the raw anger in it was unmistakable, terrifying. His face twisted with fury as his grip tightened, his knuckles white. Thaddeus, taken completely off guard, sputtered in shock. "What are you talking about, Lennox?" "What, Silas?" Lennox shouted, his voice filled with venom. "Zara told me. She showed me what they did. You think I'm going to let this go?" He shoved Thaddeus again, harder this time. "Your son is going to answer for this." Thaddeus's wife rushed to the door, her face pale with confusion and fear. "What is going on, Lennox? What is happening?" Her voice wavered on the verge of panic. Lennox's rage blinded him. He couldn't hear her, couldn't think straight. All he could see was the image of his daughter, the dolls in her hands, the innocence in her eyes. He was losing control, and nothing could stop him. Thaddeus's voice trembled as he tried to explain, but Lennox wasn't hearing him. The words barely formed on Thaddeus's lips before Lennox was bearing down on him with an intensity that bordered on feral. Rage poured out of him in waves, making his every movement sharp and dangerous. Your son did this to my daughter!" Lennox roared, the veins in his neck bulging. He shoved Thaddeus harder against the doorframe, the sound of the impact echoing through the otherwise quiet neighborhood. Thaddeus's wife, Celine, appeared in the doorway, her face pale and bewildered. "What is happening, Lennox? What is going on?" Her voice was on the verge of panic. Lennox didn't answer. He couldn't. He was too far gone, his thoughts swirling in a chaotic storm of anger and despair. His hands were clenched so tight around Thaddeus's collar that his knuckles were white. In the back of his mind, he heard Althea's voice begging him to stop, but even that was a distant, muffled sound. Thaddeus managed to stammer. "Lennox, please, there's got to be some mistake. Silas, he's just a boy. He couldn't have done this. He doesn't even understand what." "Don't," Lennox's voice cracked as he cut Thaddeus off, shaking him by the collar. "Don't you dare tell me he didn't know what he was doing. Zara told us, Thaddeus. She showed us. Your son might be the father of her child." The words were like fire burning in his throat, and the more he spoke, the hotter that fire became. His chest heaved, his breath ragged. Celine gasped, her eyes wide with shock. "No, no, that can't be right," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Silas, he's just a child. Just like Zara. There's no way." "You think we want this to be true?" Lennox shot back, his voice sharp with bitterness. "We don't know for sure yet, but your boy, he's the only one Zara talked about. You better hope we're wrong." His face twisted with frustration as he let go of Thaddeus, his fists still trembling. Before anyone could say more, Althea hurried down the street, her face flushed with worry. She had been out running errands when her phone buzzed with a frantic message from a neighbor who had seen Lennox storming towards Silas's house. When she arrived and saw her husband and Thaddeus almost at blows, her heart sank. "Stop it!" she shouted, rushing between the two men. "Lennox, stop!" She placed her hands on her husband's chest, trying to push him back. "This isn't helping. We need to calm down." Lennox growled through clenched teeth. "They're trying to tell me that Silas didn't know what he was doing." Celine looked at Althea with desperation in her eyes. "We don't even know if it's true, Althea. Silas, he's only a child. There's no way he could have caused this." "We don't know for sure," Althea said, taking a deep breath, her voice trembling but determined. "We don't know anything for sure yet. We're all just jumping to conclusions. Listen, there's only one way to really find out the truth. We need to take them for a DNA test, both Zara and Silas." There was a pause. Celine and Thaddeus exchanged a look, the color draining from their faces. The thought of Silas being tested, of having the undeniable truth revealed, terrified them. But what other choice did they have? Thaddeus finally spoke, his voice low and strained. "Fine, we'll do the test. But if it comes back negative, Lennox, you'll owe us an apology." Lennox didn't answer. The anger in his eyes still blazed. "And if it comes back positive, Thaddeus," he said, his voice hard, "I'm not sure an apology will cover what's coming." A few days later, the results were ready. The room felt cold and sterile as both families sat in tense silence at the clinic. Zara and Silas were seated on either side of the room, either fully understanding what was about to unfold. Understanding the weight of what was happening, Zara stared down at her shoes, her fingers fidgeting nervously, while Silas's hands were clenched into tight fists in his lap, his gaze fixed on the floor. The doctor entered with a solemn expression on her face, holding the results in her hand. She cleared her throat, and the tension in the room thickened. "I've reviewed the tests," she began, her voice calm but serious. "The DNA confirms that Silas is indeed the father of Zara's baby." Celine gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she turned to look at her son, who remained still, his face pale. Thaddeus slumped in his seat, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the news. Lennox's fists tightened at his sides, his face flushed with a mix of fury and disbelief. Althea, sitting beside him, pressed a hand to her mouth, her body trembling. The confirmation felt like a punch to the gut. It wasn't speculation anymore. It wasn't just a possibility. It was the truth. "I can't believe it," Celine whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Silas, how could this happen?" Thaddeus shook his head, his voice cracking as he spoke. "He's just a boy. He didn't know. He didn't mean to." but the words sounded hollow even to him. Lennox stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Your son did this to our daughter. Whether he meant to or not, he is still responsible. You are responsible. His voice rising again. Althea placed a hand on his arm, trying to calm him. Lennox, please, Althea said softly. We need to figure out what to do next. There is no going back now. We can't change what has happened. Figure out what to do next? Lennox's voice stripped with bitterness. They should have been watching their son. They let this happen, and now Zara's life is ruined. Ruined? Thaddeus shot back, his face flushed with anger. Our son is involved too. Didn't he do this alone? You act like Silas is the only one who made a mistake. It's your fault for not watching him closely. Lennox bellowed, taking a step forward, his fists clenched again. If you had raised him better, none of this would have happened. Now look where we are. The tension in the room exploded. Celine stood up, her face streaked with tears, her voice shaky but defiant. You think we wanted this? You think we haven't been asking ourselves how this happened, how we didn't see it? This is our nightmare too. Both families were now caught in a storm of blame and accusations. Words flew between them like sharp knives, each cutting deeper into the fragile fabric of their relationships. The room seemed smaller, suffocating under the weight of the anger, fear, and guilt. Meanwhile, Zara and Silas sat in the corner, caught in the middle of the chaos. They were too young to understand the gravity of what was happening, but they could feel the tension, the hostility in the air. Zara hugged her knees to her chest, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. She could hear her parents shouting, could see the angry faces of Silas's parents, and she felt something heavy settle in her chest. She didn't fully understand what was going on, but she knew deep down that it was because of her. Did we do something, Dad? She whispered to Silas, her voice trembling. Silas didn't answer right away. He stared down at his hands, his face pale and frightened. I don't know, he muttered. I didn't think we did. Zara's heart sank. The guilt was creeping in, wrapping itself around her, suffocating her. She couldn't shake the feeling that all of this, the shouting, the anger, the pain, was her fault. She hadn't meant for any of this to happen. She didn't even understand what had happened, but now everything seemed broken, and she was at the center of it. They're fighting because of us, Zara whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. Because of what we did. Silas stayed silent, but the guilt in his eyes mirrored Zara's own. Both children sat in the corner, their small bodies curled inwards, as if trying to make themselves disappear amidst the chaos of the adults. The day everyone had been dreading finally arrived. The weight of it hung over the hospital like a storm cloud. The bright, sterile lights, the beeping machines, and the hurried steps of the medical staff seemed distant to Lennox and Althea, who sat in the waiting room, barely breathing. Their world had shrunk down to this one moment, this one room, where their 10-year-old daughter was about to give birth. Lennox sat hunched over, his elbows on his knees, his face buried in his hands. He hadn't spoken in hours, not since the doctors had whisked Zara away. Althea sat beside him, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her coat. She kept glancing at the door to the delivery room, as if willing it to open, hoping that somehow everything would just stop. The tension was unbearable. Though they were still furious with Silas's family, even Thaddeus and Celine sat in their own corner of the waiting room, silent and pale. The rage that had consumed them all only days before had given way to something far darker, fear. A fear so tangible, so oppressive, that it made the air thick and suffocating. They were no longer two families at war. In that moment, they were simply parents, terrified of losing their children. Minutes turned into hours, and then a doctor, her face tight with concern, emerged from the delivery room. She walked toward them, her steps deliberate, her expression solemn. I need to speak with you both, she said, her voice calm but grave. Lennox looked up, his face hollow, while Althea's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with panic. They stood up slowly, exchanging a glance that conveyed their worst fears. Is she okay? Althea asked, her voice breaking. The doctor hesitated for a fraction of a second, just enough for Lennox to feel the weight of the world drop onto his shoulders. Zara is experiencing complications, the doctor said gently. Her body is too small for this process. Her blood pressure is dropping, and we're struggling to keep her stable. Lennox's knees buckled, and Althea grabbed his arm for support. The room spun. It felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath their feet. How bad is it? Lennox asked, his voice a rough whisper. The doctor took a deep breath. There's a 50-50 chance, Mr. and Mrs. Althea. We're doing everything we can, but her condition is critical. We need to move quickly. Althea's heart shattered at those words, the pieces falling into a pit of hopelessness. She's just a child. She whispered more to herself than to anyone else. She's too young for this. This shouldn't be happening. Lennox clenched his fists, trying to find some anchor, some way to steady the roaring storm inside him. He couldn't lose Zara. He couldn't lose his little girl. The doctor nodded with a sympathetic glance. I know this is hard to hear, but we're doing everything we can. We'll keep you updated as soon as we have more information. As the doctor turned and walked back into the delivery room, the weight of the situation pressed down on them all. Silence filled the waiting area again, but it was no longer the tense, bitter silence of two families in conflict. It was the silence of shared fear. Celine's voice broke through the stillness. Is this because of us? She asked, her voice trembling. Because of Silas? Her eyes searched Thaddeus for an answer, but he had none to give. He just shook his head, tears brimming in his eyes. Lennox couldn't take it anymore. He stood and paced, his hands trembling with both anger and helplessness. How had it come to this? His daughter's life was hanging by a thread because of a situation that should never have happened. The anger had no target now, it had all melted away, leaving only fear, confusion, and sorrow. Suddenly, the waiting room door swung open again, and Silas, standing in the doorway, his eyes wide with terror, rushed in. Silas's breath came in ragged gasps as he bolted into the hospital, running past the waiting families. His heart pounded so hard, it felt like it might burst through his chest. He had overheard Thaddeus and Celine talking to the doctors, heard them say that Zara might not make it, that she was in danger. Without thinking, without stopping to ask permission, he ran down the corridor toward the delivery room. He wasn't sure what he would do, but all he knew was that he had to be there. He had to see her. Silas! Thaddeus's voice rang out as he chased after his son, but the boy didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The nurse standing by the door tried to block him, her arms outstretched. You can't go in there, she said firmly. It's not safe. But Silas dodged past her, small and fast, slipping through the door before she could stop him. He found himself in the harsh, bright lights of the delivery room. Machines beeped, doctors moved urgently, and in the middle of it all was Zara, lying so still on the bed, pale and fragile. Her small body was hooked up to tubes and wires, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Silas's heart broke at the sight. He had never seen her like this, so vulnerable, so close to the edge. Tears welled in his eyes as he rushed to her side, grabbing her hand and holding it tightly between his own. He didn't care about the doctors, the nurses, or the chaos around him. He only cared about Zara. Zara, he whispered, his voice cracking as the tears spilled down his cheeks. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't know. I didn't know it would get this bad. His words were choked with emotion. He squeezed her hand tighter, pressing it to his chest as if trying to keep her connected to him, to keep her from slipping away. Please don't leave. Don't go. I need you. We need you. The doctors were shouting, trying to pull him away, but Silas wouldn't let go. He clung to Zara's hand as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded in a world that was spinning out of control. Zara, please! Silas sobbed. Don't leave me. For a moment, the room seemed to still, as if everything time, sound, life was holding its breath. The doctors exchanged worried glances, unsure of what to do. But something shifted in the air. Zara's hand twitched. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a slight movement. But then her fingers tightened around Silas's hand, weak, but there. The machines beeped louder as her heart rate picked up, and one of the nurses called out, "She's stabilizing." The doctors moved quickly, administering more care. Their movements a blur around Silas, but he didn't let go of Zara's hand. He couldn't. Her grip, though faint, was enough. It was hope. Outside the delivery room, both families stood frozen, watching through the small window. Althea, seeing her daughter's hand move, covered her mouth in disbelief, tears spilling down her face. Even Lennox, still tense with worry and anger, felt something break inside him, a sliver of hope fighting its way through the darkness. The minutes that followed felt like hours, but slowly, Zara's condition improved. Her heart rate steadied. Her breathing grew stronger, and the color returned to her face. The worst had passed. Eventually, Silas was gently led away from the room by a nurse, but not before he leaned down and whispered one last thing into Zara's ear. "I'm here. I'll always be here." As the doctors finished their work and Zara's condition stabilized, both families stood outside the room, watching the miraculous turn of events unfold. There were no words, just a quiet understanding that something far greater than any of them had taken place in that room. Silas's desperate plea, his unwavering hold on Zara's hand, had somehow brought her back from the brink. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was no anger, no blame, no bitterness between the two families. There was only the fragile, shared hope that Zara would be okay, and that maybe, just maybe, they could all start to heal. Then, the faint cry of a newborn broke the silence. The doctor, with a warm but tired smile, wrapped the newborn boy in a blanket and handed him to the nurse, who gently brought him over to Zara's parents. For a moment neither spoke. They just stood there, staring at the life that had been brought into the world under such impossible circumstances. It was Lennox who moved first, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the baby. Althea, watching her husband hold their grandson, gazed at the child's small face, red and wrinkled, peaceful, unaware of the turmoil that had surrounded his birth. Celine and Thaddeus stood in the corner, silently watching, their faces pale with shock, but also with relief. Althea and Celine made eye contact, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the hostility that had once been so sharp between them, the anger, the blame, all of it seemed to dissolve in that moment. Celine's eyes filled with tears, and before she could stop herself, she walked over to Althea. She hesitated, unsure if her gesture would be accepted, but then, as if some unspoken understanding passed between them, Althea opened her arms. And the two women embraced. Tears flowed freely, all the pain, all the confusion, and all the fear came pouring out in that embrace. It wasn't about blame anymore. It wasn't about who was at fault or who had suffered more. It was about something much bigger than any of them, their children, and the life they now shared. "We have to let it go," Althea whispered through her tears. "For them." Celine nodded, her own voice breaking. "For them." Lennox, still holding the baby, watched as his wife and Celine clung to each other. He felt the anger that had been consuming him for so long begin to fade away, replaced by something softer, something he hadn't felt in months: acceptance, a sense of peace. He glanced at Thaddeus, who was standing just a few steps away, looking as if he too didn't know what to do. Lennox took a deep breath and nodded toward the baby. "This is bigger than any of us," he said quietly, his voice hoarse from the strain of the day. "We have to find a way to move forward. For Zara, for Silas, and for this little one." His eyes softened as he looked down at the child, now quiet and calm in his arms. Thaddeus stepped forward, his hands shaking as he reached out to gently touch the baby's tiny hand. "We will," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We'll find a way. The two families, once so divided, stood side by side, now united in the face of the life that had just entered the world. The weight of their conflict, their anger, and their blame melted away in the presence of the child, who had unknowingly become the bridge between them. He had brought them all together in a way none of them had expected. As the hours passed and the chaos of the day slowly began to settle, the conversation turned toward the future. Zara and Silas were just children, far too young to bear the responsibility of parenthood, but the families agreed they would not let this burden fall on their shoulders alone. Althea spoke first, her voice steady now, though the emotions of the day still lingered. Zara is still a little girl. She needs time to heal, to grow. We can't expect her to take on the role of a mother. Not now. Lennox nodded, his expression serious but calm. We'll raise him, he said, glancing at Thaddeus and Celine. We need to decide on his name together. The room fell silent for a moment. Naming the child suddenly felt like the first real step toward accepting this new chapter in their lives, toward accepting the responsibility they all shared. It wasn't just about Zara or Silas anymore, it was about the boy they now all had a part in raising. Celine, still standing beside Althea, smiled softly through her tears. I think we should all be part of that decision. Althea looked at the child in Lennox's arms, then back at Celine. Caius, she whispered. It was my father's name. Thaddeus and Celine exchanged a glance, nodding slowly. It's a strong name, Thaddeus said, his voice thick with emotion. A name that means something. Lennox smiled faintly, looking down at the baby. Caius it is, then. The two families shared a quiet, solemn moment as they agreed on the name. It wasn't just a name, it was a promise that Caius would be raised with love, that he would be surrounded by both families, that he would never have to bear the weight of his birth alone. Both families agreed that Silas and Zara would continue to live their lives as children, not parents. Caius would be raised by Althea and Lennox, but Silas and his family would be there every step of the way. It wasn't just about the baby anymore, it was about healing the two children who had been swept into something far beyond their understanding. Time passed slowly at first, like the quiet unfolding of dawn after a long, sleepless night. The weeks bled into months, and somehow, after all the pain, confusion, and fear, life began to find a rhythm again. The heavy burden of anger and blame that had once weighed so heavily on both families was slowly replaced by a fragile, tentative peace. Althea and Lennox became the primary caretakers of Caius. Their home, once filled with the laughter and energy of their only daughter, now cradled the quiet breaths of a newborn. At night, when the house was still, they would peek into the nursery and watch him sleep, his tiny chest rising and falling, a reminder of the fragility and strength of life. Caius was growing, his soft features taking on a mix of both Zara and Silas. His little hands would grasp at their fingers, his wide, curious eyes scanning the world as if searching for something he had yet to understand. Silas and Zara, though still so young, seemed to have an unspoken understanding between them. They continued to play as they had always done, racing through the yard, building imaginary worlds with their toys, giggling as only children can. Yet there was something different now. They knew, even if they didn't fully grasp the enormity of it. They knew they shared something. Caius, though small and unaware, connected them in ways they couldn't yet explain. He was part of their lives, part of their future. The once strained and awkward visits from Thaddeus and Celine became more frequent and easier as the weeks went on. It was no longer about avoiding conflict or fulfilling obligations, they genuinely wanted to be there for Caius, for Zara, for Silas. They would arrive with gifts, small toys, baby clothes, and stay for hours, playing with Caius or helping with household chores. The shared responsibility of this little life began to strengthen the bond between the families in ways none of them had expected. The weight of the past remained, but it no longer hovered over them like a dark cloud. Instead, it became something that quietly sat in the background, a memory that would never fully disappear but had softened around the edges. They didn't speak about the events that had brought them together anymore. They didn't need to. The pain, the anger, it was still there, but muted, no longer controlling their lives. In its place was acceptance, a quiet understanding that they had all been through something impossible, something life-changing, and they had survived. One evening, both families gathered for dinner at Althea and Lennox's home. The air was warm, filled with the scent of home-cooked food, the hum of quiet conversation, and the occasional soft cooing from Caius, who slept peacefully in his crib beside the dining table. The room was bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun, its soft light filtering through the curtains, casting a warm hue over everything. It felt like a scene from another time, something familiar and comforting, yet extraordinary in its own way. Althea set a dish on the table, smiling as she glanced at Caius, then at the others gathered around. "He's getting bigger every day," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet pride that had blossomed over the months. "He sure is," Celine replied, her eyes never leaving the crib. "It's amazing to watch him grow. It feels like he was just born yesterday." Silas and Zara sat side by side, their laughter and chatter filling the air as they planned their next adventure, a trip to the park, a new game, anything that let them escape into their childhood, where things were simple again. They were still kids after all. Despite everything, they had found a way to return to that innocence. Lennox, watching the two families sit together, found himself exhaling a long-held breath. It hadn't been easy. It still wasn't in some ways. But seeing them all here, united around the table, he realized just how far they had come. Thaddeus raised his glass slightly, breaking the momentary silence. "To Caius," he said quietly, his voice filled with gratitude, "for bringing us together in ways we never could have imagined." Everyone nodded, clinking their glasses together softly, as if not to disturb the peaceful scene. For a brief moment, there were no words, just the sounds of silverware gently clinking on plates, the soft murmur of conversation, and the contented breathing of the baby beside them. Althea looked over at Celine, her eyes welling up. But this time, it wasn't with sorrow, it was with something deeper, understanding, love. "We're a family now," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "No matter what." Celine reached over, taking Althea's hand in hers. "Yes," she replied, squeezing gently. "We are." As the evening drew to a close, the sun dipped lower behind the hills, casting long shadows across the yard. Silas and Zara excused themselves to run outside one last time before bed. Their laughter rang out as they disappeared into the fading light. The adults sat quietly for a moment, listening to the sounds of their children, and Caius, still asleep, stirred gently in his crib as if reassured by the peace around him. In that quiet, Althea glanced at Lennox, who sat beside her. "We're going to be okay," she said softly, resting her head on his shoulder. Lennox nodded, wrapping an arm around her. "Yeah," he whispered, his eyes on the crib where their grandson slept. "We are." The past hadn't been forgotten, and the future was still uncertain. But in that moment, as the two families sat together, they knew they had found something precious, a chance to rebuild, to heal, and to love. And so, under the warm glow of the setting sun, with Caius nestled safely in his crib, two families once divided sat together, united by a bond they never expected but now couldn't imagine living without.